So welcome to Windows on Time. Today we have Kevin Keating, who is going to be doing over here at Jackson County World War I. This program is presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I'm Carrie Tannehill, Adult Services Librarian. This program is being recorded. Please mute your microphone and turn off your camera so we can have a quality recording. The recording of today's program will be uploaded to the JCLS Beyond YouTube channel within 2 weeks. And there will be time at the end for questions at the end of Kevin's presentation. If you want to put them in the chat box, you can do that, or at the end, I'll stop the recording and you can ask them directly. So the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. So just a few announcements before I give it over to Kevin. The Hanley Farm is doing summer Thursdays from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. until September 2nd. This Thursday, the Siskiyou Violins, a group of talented young violin students from Southern Oregon and Northern California will be there. Each event will have a farmer's market, picnics, garden tours, house tours, and a farm equipment matching game. And also the SOH Southern Oregon Historical Society Library is also open now, 12 to 4, Tuesday through Friday. If you want to do research, they can help you with that. And also for Jackson County Library Services, we have summer reading is happening until August 31st. You can track the books that you read or minutes and count as progress towards earning badges and prizes. And then also next month, our Windows in Time will be on August 4th from 12 to 1. Making History Together, the 75th year story of the Southern Oregon Historical Society. Alice Mullally will examine SOH's past in historic preservation and regional history education and discuss how SOHS is integral to our community in the future. So thank you for being with us today, Kevin. I'm going to go ahead and give the presentation over to you.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and I am looking forward to hopefully sharing some information that you don't know or that you find as interesting as I do. So for me, local history has always been more important or just more interesting to me because I was able to put myself kind of into the place of people living their lives through major world events. And then it also, in particular, as far as World War I spent about a week over in Kansas City at the World War I Museum and trying to determine whether the people of Southern Oregon really were interested in going to war at the time. But anyway, so hopefully we'll be able to come to a conclusion on that. Well, welcome to the presentation on Medford during the World War I period. I'll try to keep it coherent for you and hope that you find it interesting in the 50 minutes I have. And just a quick word about sources. I've used some books, The Lure of Medford by Bert Weber, and my own book on Medford, Will Miller, about Eugene Ely. But the most important research place I went was the Southern Oregon Historical Society. And they have just a great website as well as a fantastic library down on Central. So if you guys have a chance, I highly recommend getting a membership and checking that place out. Also, Ben Truey's website, Southern Oregon History Revised, was instrumental. He's done so much work on this that makes any researcher's job much more easy. The picture that you see in front of you, hopefully, is Queen Victoria. And I start this presentation kind of around around the beginning of the 20th century in 1900. Queen Victoria was the grandmother of Europe. She had ruled for 63 years, only recently surpassed by Queen Elizabeth II. But when she dies in 1901, she ushers in the Edwardian period, which is generally considered to be from about 1901 to the beginning of World War I, 1914. All the great powers of Europe at this time are enjoying great prosperity and peace, reaping the fruits of industrialism and the benefits of colonialism. The class system is at its height. You might notice that I put a Downton Abbey picture in there. This is about the time during this period when Downton Abbey kind of begins. The great powers recognized that Europe would have much to lose from an inter-European war, that their lives were good and it should be avoided at all costs. All right. In Southern Oregon, newspapers of the day were interested in the America's Cup races going on beginning in June 11th. Those races would not take place because later in June, events take a force of their own. In Southern Oregon, we also are having an amazing period of prosperity. Kind of began in the late 1900s, I guess. Prosperity, growth, and peace. In 1911, especially, an orchard boom brought in lots of Eastern people and money, buying orchards and participating in creating actually high society. George Kramer writes in his Oregon Encyclopedia, the new city attracted wealthy immigrants, many from Chicago, following in the footsteps of Mrs. Potter Palmer, who developed the Modoc orchards. Other Chicagoans made the move, including Harvard-educated H. Chandler Egan, the U.S. amateur golf champion in 1904 and 1905, who moved to Medford and transformed his orchard into a golf course, the first in Southern Oregon. Easterners, Dr. C.R. Ray, supported by the wealthy brother Colonel Frank H. Ray, invested in area gold mines and developed the Gold Ray Dam at Tolo, the first large-scale hydroelectric facility in the Rogue Valley. Many well-off college graduates, notably Alfred and Leonard Carpenter, arrived during the orchard boom and helped build the orchard industry and the social climate in the Rogue Valley. The men established the University Club, and their wives formed the Colony Club, the correspondent organization for women. The population grew almost 400% between 1900 and 1910. Improvements included buildings like the Hotel Medford, the Natatorium Swimming Complex, the Carnegie Library, Sacred Heart Hospital, which was the largest between Portland and San Francisco, the Sparta Building, which remains on Central and Main, Riverside and Maine, and then both Jackson and Roosevelt schools, and the new spacious railway depot, which is now Porter's, and even Hawthorne Park, which at one time was the site of the Pacific and Eastern Depot. Lastly, there was a new water system with fresh water brought down from Fish Lake. Logging also was prospering all around the valley, especially in Butte Falls, and the railroad going Pacific and Eastern going from Medford to Butte Falls through Eagle Point brought a lot of those logs back to the national market. The automobile industry was thriving. In fact, Mail Tribune claims that in 1909, Medford, Oregon, leads the world in the number of autos per capita. This is just before the moving assembly line at Ford's Highland Park in 1913. And Medford, in July of 1914, says the Mail Tribune, had more paved roads at 20 miles than any city of its size in the world, including the Pacific Highway, the Pacific Highway, which is now 99, between Ashland all the way to Central Point. That's not all. Transportation-wise, airplane technology was growing also. Now, the Wright brothers flew the first powered flight in 1903 in North Carolina, Kitty Hawk. The first airplane to fly over Southern Oregon was a mere 7 years later, in 1910, flown by early famed pilot Eugene Ely. He wasn't famed yet, actually, by 1910. The flights didn't go so well. There wasn't enough wind, etc. He promised to come back, and he did. But also in the air industry, by 1920, Southern Oregon had an airfield at Medford, and by 1926, Seeley Hall and Floyd Hart brought together regular air service to Medford with Pacific Air Transport, which eventually merged into United Airlines. But back to 1910. Eugene Ely had tried to fly, but was stymied, as I said, by the little wind, and he came back a year later. But in the meantime, in January of 1911, he becomes the first pilot to actually land a plane on well, we wouldn't call it an aircraft carrier, but it was a military cruiser, a Navy cruiser with a platform built on top of it. The plane he was using was a Curtiss Pusher, which looked somewhat like the Wright brothers plane, if you can imagine it. He also was the first person to ever use a tail hook to catch him before he sailed off the edge of the boat, and then was the first pilot to actually take off from a ship. So he became extremely famous at that point, and he wanted to work for the Navy more, but they did not have a naval aviation program. And so they told him, just stay safe. We're going to create it soon, and you'd be one of the first we put on there. Instead of staying safe, he does exhibitions across the country of his daring And one of those was in June of 1911, 6 months later. He fulfills his return and demonstrates all sorts of daring feats of flight for the first time ever in Southern Oregon, thrilling the crowds who had mostly never seen any of these flights before. Sadly, 4 months later, in October 1911, the 24-year-old aviator would die in a crash during a similar demonstration, widowing his 21-year-old wife. Okay, rail was huge in Oregon. The Golden Spike was driven in Ashland in 1887, completing the California and Oregon Railroad and allowing Southern Oregon growers to merge with the larger national market. Passenger rail service grew as well with the Rogue River Valley Railroad to Jacksonville in 1891, and the Medford and Crater Lake Railroad, which became the Pacific and Eastern, up through Eagle Point to Butte Falls. Never did make it to Crater Lake. And Medford had a trolley, which ran from the SP Depot east across Main Street Bridge, all the way past Sacred Heart Hospital and the golf course to what is now Kensington Street, up to the reservoir. Women in Oregon win the vote in 1912, just prior to the World War, and elect the first female House of Representatives legislator. 1913 saw the issue of rowdiness downtown in Medford come to the fore. Citizens protested to the city council, which claimed that they could not do anything about it. Reverend D.D. Boyle, at a special meeting of the council, says, "Now we must go home and tell our families and children we are helpless against vice and immorality, and our boys and girls must grow up surrounded by these conditions." City Attorney McCabe had said that the city government and officials were absolutely helpless to suppress prostitution, that the council had no authority to order the police to close notorious resorts, and that the new law permits the closing of disreputable houses because of the new law that permits the closing of disreputable houses because of common fame is unconstitutional. With this, everyone attending the meeting walks out, and the controversy continues. Yet in 1 year, the city would clean up Front Street and the Badlands, as they were called, in 1914. 1913 also witnessed the first killing of a law enforcement official. Sheriff August Singler was killed as he tried to deliver a warrant. He had been pioneering in the use of fingerprinting to solve crimes, and as he approached a man's cabin, the suspect opened fire, striking Sheriff Singler in the chest. Although mortally wounded, he was able to return fire and shot the suspect 6 times, killing him. Singler left 8 children, as you can see in the picture. Now, originally, this picture had 7 children in it, and when he had his 8th child, we'd call it today, photoshopped it in there, but he actually just probably stickered it in there, I guess. And then you can see he wrote on the top there a little bit of humor. It says, "Arrived since the primary." His funeral was one of the largest ever in Medford, and his descendants are still prominent in Southern Oregon still. So in order to talk a little bit about what was going on here, we have to talk about how the war began. Probably the most senseless possible events ever. In Europe, as mentioned, the 5 major powers, the 5 great powers, were England, France, Germany, Russia, and Austria, Austria-Hungary to be more specific. They did not want to get into a war. They knew how destructive it would be. In fact, the Kaiser, the King of England, and the Tsar were all basically well-acquainted cousins of each other and had all mourned together at Victoria's funeral back in 2001. Germany had united in 1871 and was the fastest growing of the 5 great powers militarily and economically. But it was surrounded geographically by rivals. To that end, Chancellor Bismarck of Germany had managed an alliance system with the intent of always being allied with at least 2 other powers, one of which had to be Russia, in order to avoid a 2-front war. In 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm removed Chancellor Bismarck and foolishly allowed the Russian alliance to lapse. So, shortly after that, in 1914, when the 19-year-old Serbian Gavrilo Princip shoots the heir to the throne of Austria and his wife in Bosnia, which is down in the Balkans, on June 28th of 1914, Austria threatens war on Serbia. Normally, this would be a low-powered event that would not draw everybody in, but the alliance system made it much more complicated. Russia is a fellow Slavic nation with along the same lines as Serbia, and was pressured into coming into the aid of Serbia. Russia threatens Austria with war if it were to attack Serbia, and Austria declares war anyway and bombs Belgrade. Russia begins to mobilize its troops, and Wilhelm of Germany is committed to its only ally, Austria, and declares war on Russia for mobilizing. Because if you mobilize your troops in Russia against Austria, clearly they would be doing that against the German Empire. And when one country or a rival country mobilizes, you have to mobilize your army. So Germany declares war on Russia, but Russia, thanks to Wilhelm firing Bismarck, Russia now has a treaty with France, so that in the case of a German attack, France would come to the aid of Russia. Germany has now blundered into the very two-front war that it was trying to avoid. That's not good for France, because the only way that Germany has determined that it could win a two-front war would be to attack France and capture Paris quickly, which is very, in northern France, close to the German border. Capture it quickly and then turn its armies all the way back against Russia so it can then be fighting a one-front war. Now, the German border with France is heavily fortified with forts, and the only way the Germans could possibly capture Paris quickly would be if they went through the neutral territory of Belgium to get there. Problem is, Belgium has its protector as England. England has vowed to protect Belgium in the case of its sovereignty being challenged. And despite the best interests of the English people, and probably in order to also keep Germany and its navy from attaining French ports on the Atlantic, England declares war on Germany. And thus, by August 4th, 3 days after the beginning of the war, and basically a month after the assassination of the Archduke, all of Europe is at war, with some notable exceptions: Spain, Portugal, etc. All right. This war was to be so much more horrific in terms of death and destruction on a massive scale that no one in hindsight would have allowed it. But no votes were taken, no people were sampled. The war simply arose on its own pretext. Once war was declared, most of the armies were enthusiastic with jingoism, but that would end again after mere days once the rapidity of the carnage became clear. There are estimates that about 40 million casualties and 20 million deaths worldwide were a result of this misunderstanding, if you will. Numbers are hard to pin down, but suffice it to say that casualties started out worse than had ever been before and got worse every succeeding year as killing technology improved. In the last 4 months of 1914 alone, at the beginning of the war, the first 4 months, if you will, hundreds of thousands of lives had already been lost at battles in Liège, Belgium, Mons, France, the Marne, Tannenberg against the Russians, and Ypres. Throwing in there as well Serbia and Austria. Industrialization had created barbed wire, machine guns, massive artillery shells, trenches, and soon mustard gas, flamethrowers, and tanks. These would be used against men dressed up with swords and riding horses into battle, racing forward to meet their fate. One particularly poignant example of this were the college boys you see on the lower left that were taken straight out of college and put into the lines. They had very little training but much enthusiasm, and their first assignment was against a crack British outfit, very small outfit, but extremely well disciplined and well trained. The German boys were completely wiped out in their first battle. This is now known as the Kindermord, or Massacre of the Innocents. An English witness describes it: the enemy seemed to rise out of the ground and sweep towards us like a great tidal wave, but our machine guns poured steel into them at a rate of 600 shots per minute, and they'd go down like grass before the scythe. The Germans were climbing over heaps of their own dead only to meet the same fate. German and British soldiers in the early parts of the war, this first 4 months, created their own truce on Christmas Eve, 1914. You can see those pictures in the upper right and upper left. They played soccer, they traded food, and sang Christmas carols together. Higher officers, fearing that peace or worse, socialism might break out, disciplined them severely, and it never happened again. In the lower right, you can see some of the troops dressed almost as if they were Napoleonic soldiers going to war in the first parts of 1914. I'm sorry, the last months of 1914. Well, the good news is the Americans were not in it yet. German armies had come within a few miles of Paris, fulfilling the Schlieffen Plan, but were turned back in the Battle of the Marne, and from that point on, a network of defensive trenches grew between Switzerland in the south, all the way up north to the sea. And those trenches would substantially remain in the same locations as hundreds of thousands of people passed away, without gaining territory on either side. In the east, the Russians did finally mobilize and get their troops into eastern Prussia and were crushed by the Germans under Hindenburg and Ludendorff, losing about 250,000 casualties on the Russian side. So what's going on in Medford in 1914? Splendid isolation. Work on paving continues. They're cracking down on the Badlands at this point. A.A. Johnson was sentenced to 25 years, or 2 to 25 years, in the state prison yesterday by Judge Morrow. The state institution will not be entirely new for the old man. He was there once before. He received the verdict with no show of emotion. So a 72-year-old man convicted of living in a house of fame. The trolley, as I said, was moving on. You see the auto industry in the lower right-hand side. That's the Sparta building. Electricity from Gold Ray Dam. Medford is really enjoying the 1914s. In April 14, New Yorkers bought Sunset Orchard, so the orchard industry is continuing well. There is news in the papers of the Mexican Revolution. In 1914, Zapata and Pancho Villa had ousted the President Huerta. The revolution would continue in Mexico throughout the war, and Mexico soon would play a part in America's entry to that war. Moving on to 1915. By the way, that's Chandler Egan at the Country Club. Pretty nice view of southeastern Medford from there. And women's suffrage, by the way, I mentioned it had passed in 1912. The first election where women were really allowed to vote in large numbers was in 1914, and Marion Town of Phoenix was elected the first female legislator in 1914 and to the Oregon House of Representatives. Her term began on January 1st, that is, of 1915, and she studied at Michigan Law School for a while and was endorsed by Mayor Cannon and the Mail Tribune publisher George Putnam. She introduced some bills on school funding and for a girls' industrial home, but was not reelected in 1916. But later, we'll talk about how she did serve as a yeoman F, or a yeomanette, as they were sometimes called. And then after the war, she was discharged in her rank as a chief yeoman, F for female. Okay, so 1915 in Europe, the Lusitania is sunk by a U-boat from the German side. The Lusitania had sailed from New York. People were well aware that it was sailing into a war zone, and the Germans had warned in the New York papers not to board the vessel or any other vessels traveling into the war zone. Nevertheless, the ship was sunk, and it sank in a very short amount of time, precluding the ability to capture any survivors. Obviously, even though the law of the sea says that if you sink a vessel, you should pick up survivors, the submarines could not do so. They didn't have the room to do it anyway. Sank off the coast of Ireland and some survivors did survive, but about 200 Americans lost their lives, about 1,100 others. 1915 saw in Europe the beginning of aerial bombing of cities, which was probably still is a war crime. And the Germans began it with their fabled Zeppelins, as you can see there. 1915 was the beginning of the Armenian genocide. Turkey had joined the war effort on the side of Germany and invaded Russia, or actually attacked Russia. And they tried to invade it, and it was a horrible massacre. They blamed this on Armenians and were merciless in removing Armenians and starving them, etc. Poison gas in 1915. As if it weren't bad enough, throw in a little bit of poison gas, and the situation was made worse, of course. Now everyone had to be traveling with masks, being able to put them on quickly, etc. And if you've worn masks at all during our current epidemic, you know that it's much harder to do physical activity. And oftentimes the poison gas that you sent over to the lines to try to defeat the enemy would blow back onto your own troops as a result of wind change. Just a horrible invention. It was outlawed after World War I. 1915 was the Gallipoli disaster. So bringing in some of the colonies, the Australians and the Kiwis from New Zealand were brought in to attack the Ottoman Empire and try to defeat it, or eventually capture Constantinople. It was a huge debacle and disaster, and they eventually had to leave with great loss of life. Back to the Lusitania. In 1915 in Medford, there's kind of an interesting story about this woman, Dorothy Connor. She survived the Lusitania sinking. She had been educated in Germany, actually graduated with a BA in history from Wellesley in 1908. She traveled first class with a $285 ticket to help in the East by somehow being a nurse. She had lived on an estate here in Medford, actually, called Sundown Hill, possibly near South Stage Road and Griffin Creek. She was in the upper crust, obviously. She confessed in one of the letters she sent from Lusitania, "It's been such a dull, dreary, stupid trip. I can't help hoping that we'll get some kind of thrill going up the channel." She wrote to her mother that she couldn't have taken a more uneventful or stupid voyage. Careful what you wish for there, Dorothy. She jumped off the ship. She was in the upper part of the ship and was able to jump off it in time to be rescued, although it was dicey for a while. And after the rescue, she was brought into the port of Queenstown, or Cove in Ireland, and immediately went to the hotel and asked for a single room with bath, and was surprised when they laughed at me, she recalled. She also received a lecture on being selfish. She eventually worked in a canteen entertaining the troops near the front lines in 1916. And when the war ended, Dorothy was awarded the Croix de Guerre from the French government for her bravery in her service in canteen and hospital work. She is written about, if any of you are interested in Dorothy Connor, she's written about in the very popular book by Eric Larson called Dead Wake. Good book. 1915 in Medford, the new federal building on 6th Street was created. The Hotel Grand, which still exists across from Porter's. And then there's some interesting stories in the local press. Major General White, he was the adjutant general then, praised Company 7 of the Oregon National Guard for its training and good drilling. Southern Pacific at this time announces special rates to the 1915 World's Fair in San Francisco. The first pictures of the European War were shown at the Page Theater to a capacity house. Oregon began issuing licenses at this time to drive automobiles. The police were ordered to arrest all wanderers and make them work cleaning alleys and vacant lots. I thought that was kind of interesting. Seeley Hall he was a pretty famous Medford. He went down to the exhibit at the Panama Pacific Exposition, and Southern Oregon had an exhibit there, and claimed that the Southern Oregon exhibits were worse than pitiful, not better than nothing. The apples were wormy. So that was a big black eye, I would think, for the agricultural industry at that time. As I said, Company 7 was highly praised by the Major General for its appearance. And General George White, who you see in this picture here, actually is the same General White who Camp White was named after, and therefore White City was named after. He eventually became a Major General serving in World War I. Other things, a number of Ashland teachers attend a public dance and face discipline if not dismissal, as the right-thinking public is thoroughly aroused. Agents of the British government had purchased 14 Rogue River Valley horses. They will be shipped to the war zone and will never see these parts again. The odds are that those horses would not live long, I'm sure. H. Chandler Eaglin urges revival of golf in the valley to take the war off the minds of businessmen. The Liberty Bell was en route to the Panama Fair and stopped for 30 minutes on this evening of July 16th, that is. Passed through at 2 o'clock in the morning and still was viewed by 5,000 people from different parts of the county. Travel to Crater Lake on the exceptional roads in Jackson County exceeded all records. Camping ground for tourists to the back of the natatorium is now ready for use. So many automobile tourists would drive around and stay in camps, often for free, especially in Ashland and in Medford, on their way up to Crater Lake or other parts of Oregon. William Jennings Bryan addressed an audience of more than 7,000 people at a city park in Medford. The theme of the address was War and Peace, with special reference to the present conditions in Europe. The speaker, Bryan, advocated arbitration as the proper method for settling all international disputes. He was feted at the Hotel Medford afterwards and was received very well. It's interesting because we're talking about July of 1915, and people are very willing to accept that we should stay out of the war in Europe. Lastly, in 1915, the city greeted the new year, it says in the Mail Tribune, with wild acclaim and joy. Many facetious comments were made regarding the closing of the saloons forever and the end of John Barleycorn in Oregon. Everybody with a taste for liquor has a cupboard full, and a few have laid in a supply of good liquor sufficient to last a lifetime. The Mail Tribune thinks that the dry law will at least keep the booze away from the young folks. So what they're referring to there is December 31st of 1915 will be the last time that you are allowed to drink liquor in the state of Oregon. Perhaps. All right. 1916 brings the Battle of Verdun, February through December. Germans intentionally lure French into the meat grinder trap. Successful, in other words, they knew that France would have to come in, and they had artillery all around that area and created extremely high casualties for the French. The French persisted and caused an almost equal amount of casualties from the Germans, so it was simply for no gain. 750,000 young men gave their lives. Not to be outdone, the Battle of the Somme in the northern part up near Belgium, from July through October of 1916, created 1 million casualties. Just massive amounts of casualties because the only way to attack the trenches were to be with massive artillery strikes that lasted days upon days, oftentimes just crushing the mental abilities of these soldiers that were underneath them. The worst day in the entire military history of the United Kingdom, 57,000 casualties in one day. Just for comparison, Antietam in the Civil War was the bloodiest in U.S. history, where we had 22,000 in one day from both sides, south and north. Mexican Revolution is still raging. Pancho Villa has kidnapped and killed Americans and then invaded Columbus, New Mexico. So we've got our own little seemingly war on our southern border, and Wilson sends in General Pershing and 6,000 American troops to find and punish Pancho Villa. Other things in 1916 in Medford, again, we mentioned prohibition. Saloons turned into creameries and soda fountains. Crime fell precipitously, except for those coming from California on the train or otherwise. The movie Birth of a Nation makes its debut at the Page Theater. Wilson wins re-election in 1916 on a platform of keeping the U.S. out of war. That was in November of 1916. And lastly, the United States Shipping Board launches the Medford cargo ship on August 28th of 18. It started building it in 1916 as a precursor to the Liberty ships. All these ships were scrapped in 1924 as a result of Henry Ford purchasing 200 of them for about $8,500 a vessel and recycling them into Ford automobiles. 1917 comes to Passchendaele. This is the third time that the British and Germans were fighting over the same piece of land in a town in Belgium called Ypres. I don't know if I have that pronunciation correct, but by this time the town has been completely flattened. No trace, if any at all, of the town itself, and the fields around the battle were just turned into mud. Heavy rain ensued, craters from the shells, and men were drowning in just mud puddles that they could not climb out of. It was horrific. 800,000 casualties there. The numbers keep going up. But soon the Americans will be there, right? Because we just can't keep away from a good time. 1917 also going on in the war. The blockade is hurting Germany. The blockade of the British around the Germans, as well as the Dutch and the Belgians, can't get any food either. France and England are able to buy supplies from America. This does not please the Germans. The Americans do not press the fact that the English are keeping the Americans out from trading with Germany. So Germany resumes its unrestricted submarine warfare, which it had stopped after the Lusitania. Germany gambles that America cannot ramp up fast enough to help England if it does get into the war, so they don't have much to lose at this point. Germany at this point also thinks that if we do get into a war with America, it might be good to see if we can make some overtures to the Mexican government. And they say that in the case of war, if Mexico joins in Germany's side, that they will give back the territories that America got from the Mexicans after the Mexican War. The Mexicans, this message was intercepted by the British before the Mexicans could even reply. Not that they would have found favor in that proposal anyway, but the British intercepted and immediately show it to the Americans, and it gets out into the public. Zimmerman could have denied it, but does not, which basically sealed the fate of the Germans, if you will, and the Americans decide that in April of 1917, Germany continues sinking American ships in the war zone. Wilson declares that war is already on between Germany and America, and we decide to get in on the side of the Allies. Also in 1917, of course, the Tsar is overthrown in Russia, and Lenin, who is a communist, was sent to Russia by the Germans to cause more trouble. And he does cause trouble. It causes the communist revolution, which Germany will not be happy about later. So what's going on in Medford in 1917? Congress has passed the Espionage Act, and the Oregon Company 7 of the National Guard mobilizes. Mayor Gates's son serves in France. And in the picture here of Company 7, you can see, I believe, the Hotel Grand in the background with a corner of the railroad station, now Porter's, and then some buildings on Front Street. This is Mayor Gates, second from the right, and his son, I believe it's Charles, and he sees him off right here at the Medford Depot. Gates was an interesting character. As mayor, he would intimidate any who would speak out against the war or did not contribute enough to the war bond drives or looked like slackers in any way. So his son contracts the flu in France, and Gates is concerned because there's no way of getting any money to them. They have no money, and he's very unhappy in the hospital over there. All right. At this time in 1907, actually that wouldn't be 17. Okay. The Yeomanettes. The Yeomanettes are independent women already working outside the home, and they were the job that they would do would be to relieve the Navy from using men who could otherwise fight from doing the clerical duties that these women could do just as well. They were first ordered to the Puget Navy Yard in Bremerton, and their actual rank was yeoman. F designated female, and they received the same pay actually as male yeoman, which is great. Pictured is the former representative of the legislature, Marion Town. She served very well as yeoman and retired as didn't retire. She left the service as a chief yeoman, F, after the war and paid very well. They didn't like, by the way, being called yeomanettes because they preferred to be called just yeomen, actually because they were doing the same job. And let's see. Jackson County's, they were called Blue Star Daughters in some ways. They were among the first 100 women in the United States to join the Naval Reserve and serve their country in a military unit. Before the armistice was signed, more than 11,000 women had enlisted, but the first ones were here from Medford. This is Harry Lane. I mentioned that there were some people in Congress who did not vote for the war declaration. One of them was Oregon Senator Harry Lane, grandson of Joe Lane. He was an advocate for women's suffrage and Indian rights, and his vote against the war was extremely unpopular, even in Oregon. And Mayor Gates, you can imagine his theory on it. He was subject to recall, and prior to that could even take place, though, he died about a month after the vote, replaced by McNary, I believe it was. All right. Time's getting short. In 1918, in Europe, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, Russia pulls out of the war and leaves it to the Allies. So Germany is able to use all its troops against the Western Allies. But at the same time, American troops are materializing on the border at a rate of about 10,000 a day. So clearly we're making the difference over on that side. American troops fight hard at Cantigny and the Meuse-Argonne. They're in the air service, obviously the Navy as well. The Kaisers, they have a massive battle with another 1 million casualties after a German last-ditch effort in 1918 was pushed back. Kaiser abdicates, and the Germans seek armistice on the basis of Wilson's 14 points, much of which consisted of the League of Nations and the idea that peoples should be able to self-determine their own government. In other words, popular sovereignty. And that would be taken up in the Treaty of Versailles. The Spanish flu hits America and Europe. And at this time, I'll just read a little bit here. The Medford chapter of the American Red Cross is in distress over the situation as it exists in the workrooms. The demand for flu masks is still very great, and orders from the local drugstores cannot be filled. So they were supposed to wear masks, but they couldn't make enough of them in time. In Medford, chronicles from Sacred Heart Hospital begin to be alarmed with news that the flu had arrived. The sisters and nurses admitted their first patients, and the caregivers succumbed to the illness one after another, and it was only at the price of heroic efforts that we stayed at the task in providing to the most pressing needs. Another Medford archivist wrote, unbounded by the hospital's walls of brick, the sisters visited the ill in their homes and kept night watches with the suffering. Very dangerous thing to do. They got high praise from the rest of the community. There had been some anti-Catholicism, and this was alleviated to a great degree. However, the KKK would rise in 1921 in Medford anyway, as mostly an anti-Catholic organization in this iteration. All right. Yeah, as we saw in the recent epidemic, Mayor Gates closes churches, lodges, schools, and all public meetings. All right. 12:45, got about 5 minutes. Just one little piece about Mayor Gates I think is interesting. George Maynard, a member of the International Bible Students Association, was basically tarred and feathered in the city of Medford at the insistence of Mayor Gates. So he's ordered to leave the city. Unable to catch Pastor Taliaferro, Medford vigilantes followed him to Ashland and seized local leader of the cult of Russellites, George Maynard, and printed iron crosses on him. Failing in their efforts to get their hands on him, let's see. They then released him with the warning for himself and his wife to leave Medford and Jackson County by Monday morning, else something more violent and serious would happen to him. Maynard promised to go. What was the crime that these people were doing? He was mentioning to people in the streets that the Russellites were a pacifist organization and did not agree with the war. So here is just some of the pictures I was able to come up with of some of the people from Medford who were killed in the war. Many of them were killed from disease, and others were killed in actual battle. Here's Laughlin and Morgan. They're just poignant pictures, I think. Treffren and Morgan. Morgan from Ashland, Spooner from Medford. On the left is Lieutenant Newell Barber, who our first airport was named after. At 17, he left to fly in the Air Corps and was killed in 1918 in battle, and his body was never found. He is replaced in, sorry about that. There is a plaque for him in the military cemetery in France. On the right-hand side, you see a memorial built in front of the Carnegie Library for these troops on Remembrance Day, which later became Memorial Day, 1919. All right. So that's it. Are there any questions? And thank you for listening.